Hello, everyone. You're standing in your kitchen wearing the pale blue dress you picked out with such care for your daughter's wedding, only to hear her voice on the phone, calm but firm, saying, "You're not welcome." Then, the very next morning, as your heart still aches from the sting of rejection, your new son-in-law shows up at your door, his eyes red with tears, carrying a truth that changes everything. That was the moment I, Eleanor, realized that love and pain often walk hand in hand. But it's in the broken places that we find the strength to rebuild. Today, I want to share my story, a journey from heartbreak to healing, from a mother pushed aside to a woman rediscovering her own light. If you've ever faced a moment that shook your soul, I'd love to hear where you're joining us from in the comments below. Please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, and let's dive into this heartfelt tale together. I stood in my kitchen, still wearing the pale blue dress I'd chosen for my daughter Margaret's wedding. It was a modest dress with delicate lace sleeves and a hem that swayed just above my ankles, bought from a small boutique in downtown Richmond. I'd imagined the moment so many times, how Margaret would turn to me with that shy smile of hers, how we'd share a quiet moment as I pinned a pearl brooch, a family heirloom, to her gown, how I'd whisper, "You'll always be my little girl." I saw us laughing, maybe crying, as we walked arm in arm toward the aisle at St. Paul's Episcopal Church, where I'd baptized her as a baby. But none of that happened. Instead, her voice came through the phone, steady and sharp. "Mom, I think it's best if you don't come." No explanation, no softness, just those words, like a door slamming shut in a house I'd built with my own hands. I was 68 years old, a widow who'd raised my only child through decades of love and sacrifice. The house was too quiet that morning, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes every creak of the old oak floorboards feel like an intrusion. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at a pot of coffee I couldn't bring myself to drink. On the counter sat the gift I'd made for Margaret, a quilt hand-stitched over months, each square holding a memory. The flannel from her childhood blanket, the cotton from her prom dress, the silk from my own wedding gown. I kept glancing at the clock, knowing the ceremony had begun without me. I didn't cry, not yet. I just gripped the edge of the table, praying it might anchor me to a world that felt like it was slipping away. The next morning, a knock startled me. I was still in that wrinkled dress, the fabric heavy with the weight of what hadn't been. I opened the door slowly, expecting a neighbor or the mailman with another catalog for hearing aids I didn't need. But there stood Daniel, Margaret's new husband, his suit jacket unbuttoned, his face pale and drawn. He wasn't the confident young man I'd met 2 years ago at a church picnic. He looked broken, like a man carrying a burden too heavy for his shoulders. "Can we talk, Eleanor?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, stepping aside, and as he crossed the threshold of my little house on Maple Street, I felt the stir of something new, a truth waiting to be spoken. Before the silence, before the heartbreak, before the wedding I wasn't allowed to attend, there was love. Deep, unshakable love. The kind that roots itself in your soul and grows stronger with every season. That was my life with Margaret. She was my only child, born in the summer of 1985 during a sweltering August in Richmond, Virginia, after a labor that tested every ounce of my strength. My husband, George, was still with us then, a quiet man who fixed cars at the local garage and filled our home with the warm notes of his Nat King Cole records. We'd prayed for a child through 3 heartbreaking miscarriages, and when Margaret arrived, her tiny hand curling around my finger, It was as if the Lord had handed me a miracle. George passed when Margaret was 3, taken by a sudden heart attack that left me a widow at 31. I was alone with a toddler, a mortgage, and a grief that felt like it might swallow me whole. But I never let Margaret feel the weight of our loss. I took a job as a secretary at the high school during the day and waited tables at Betty's Diner in the evenings, serving coffee to truckers and night owls. Every penny went to keeping our little house, with its creaky front porch and rose bushes, I tended like they were family. I made sure Margaret's world was warm and safe. She had homemade Halloween costumes sewn from thrift store fabric, library books stacked by her bed, and birthday cakes I baked from scratch, even when my hands ached from a double shift. We were a team, Margaret and I. She was a bright, curious girl with her father's hazel eyes and a laugh that could light up the gloomiest day. We had rituals that defined our life together. Sunday mornings at St. Paul's, where she'd fidget through sermons but sing Amazing Grace with all her heart. Friday nights with pizza and old movies, like It's a Wonderful Life or The Sound of Music, curled up under a quilt on our sagging couch. Summer evenings on the porch, where I'd read her Little Women while fireflies blinked in the yard. She told me everything. Her first crush on a boy named Tommy. Her fears about starting middle school, the time she snuck out at 16 to a party and came home in tears, knowing she'd let me down. I never judged her. I wanted her to believe in love, in loyalty, in the family we'd built from the ashes of loss. When she brought Daniel home at 27, I saw the way he looked at her, like she was the only star in his sky. He was a history teacher at the local high school, soft-spoken, with a habit of pushing his glasses up his nose when he was nervous. I liked him right away, not just because he treated Margaret with kindness, but because he listened to her dreams of opening a bookstore someday. When they got engaged, I cried, not out of sadness, but because it felt like a new chapter for us all. I pictured helping her plan the wedding, driving to bridal shops, laughing over guest lists, maybe dancing with her at the reception to George's favorite song, Unforgettable. I started a scrapbook, filling it with ideas, sketches of table settings, swatches of lace, a recipe for her favorite lemon pound cake. I polished my mother's pearl brooch, planning to give it to her on her wedding day, a symbol of the women who'd come before her. We even planned together once. Margaret came over one crisp October evening, her cheeks flushed from the autumn chill, carrying a thermos of hot cider. We sat at my kitchen table, flipping through bridal magazines, circling dresses, and debating whether roses or peonies would suit her better. She teased me for suggesting a vintage veil, calling me old-fashioned, and I swatted her arm, laughing. That night felt like the old days, when it was just the two of us against the world. I held on to it, not knowing it would be the last time we'd share that kind of warmth. The change didn't come overnight. It was gradual, like the way autumn creeps into summer, stealing the light a little at a time. At first, I thought it was just wedding stress. Margaret stopped calling as often, her voice clipped when we did talk. Our weekly coffee dates at Betty's Diner faded, replaced by vague excuses about work or errands. Her texts became short. Busy, Mom. Talk soon. I didn't push. I'd raised her to be independent, and I told myself she'd come back when the chaos settled. But the signs were there, and I ignored them, because I couldn't bear to believe our bond was fragile. I sent her a photo of my mother's lace tablecloth, asking if she'd like to use it for the reception. She replied, "We're going modern, Mom. Thanks anyway." I offered to help with invitations, and she said they'd hired a calligrapher. When I suggested hosting a brunch for her childhood friends, she dismissed it. That's not the vibe we're going for. Each rejection was small, but they piled up like stones, building a wall I couldn't climb. The moment that broke something in me came at a lunch with Daniel's parents, Robert and Patricia, at a fancy restaurant downtown. I'd been excited to meet them, hoping it would pull me back into Margaret's world. The place was all glass and polished wood, with waiters who hovered like ghosts. Robert and Patricia were polished too. Him in a tailored blazer, her in pearls and a silk scarf. I felt out of place in my simple cardigan, but I smiled and tried to keep up. When the conversation turned to the wedding, I mentioned a local baker who'd done my niece's cake, thinking it might help. Margaret cut me off, her voice sharp. "We've got it handled, Mom." The table went silent. Patricia raised an eyebrow, and Robert cleared his throat. I laughed it off, but my cheeks burned. It wasn't just the dismissal. It was the way Margaret looked at me, like my enthusiasm was something to be ashamed of. After that, the distance grew colder. She stopped sharing updates. I learned about her bridal shower from a neighbor who'd seen photos on Facebook. When I commented, "What a beautiful day," on one of the posts, she didn't reply. I told myself it was temporary, that she was overwhelmed, maybe influenced by Patricia, who seemed to view me as a small-town nobody. But deep down, I started to wonder if I was losing her. Not to time or circumstance, but to a choice she was making. One afternoon, I stopped by her apartment with a basket of her favorite oatmeal cookies and a box of keepsakes, her old Sunday school drawings, a locket from her grandmother, a photo of us at the county fair when she was 10. Daniel answered the door, looking uneasy. "She's not up for visitors," he said, taking the basket with a forced smile. A week later, the box was returned to my porch, unopened. That was when I knew. This wasn't just distance. It was erasure. The final blow came on a quiet Tuesday evening as I sat knitting a scarf for the church's winter charity drive. My phone buzzed, and I saw I'd been added to a group chat called Maggie's Wedding Crew. My heart lifted. I thought maybe Margaret had changed her mind, that this was her way of bringing me back in. But when I opened the chat, my stomach dropped. It was a flurry of messages from bridesmaids, cousins, and friends I barely knew, joking about the wedding plans. Then I saw it, a thread about me. "Maggie says her mom will lose it if she's not front and center at the ceremony," one wrote. "Total clingy mom energy." Another chimed in. "I bet she shows up in a white dress. Ha! Someone keep an eye on her." Laughter emojis followed. My hands shook as I scrolled, and then I saw Margaret's reply. "She means well, but she's just too much. I can't deal with her guilt trips right now." The words hit like a punch. Guilt trips? I'd spent months stepping back, giving her space, swallowing my hurt to avoid being too much. And here she was, painting me as the problem to a room full of strangers. I realized I'd been added by mistake. They didn't know I was there, reading every word, watching my life be reduced to a punchline. I didn't respond. I didn't leave the chat right away. I just sat there, the knitting needles still in my lap, the yarn tangled like my thoughts. Eventually, I exited the group quietly and turned off my phone. I didn't cry. I felt hollow, like the woman I'd been, Margaret's mother, her rock, her home, had been erased. The next day, Margaret texted, "Just confirming you're not on the seating chart, right?" No mention of the chat, no apology, just logistics. I stared at the message, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I wanted to scream, to demand why she'd turned me into a stranger. But instead, I wrote, "Yes, I won't be there. Wishing you a beautiful day." I pressed send and felt something break inside me, not just my heart, but the hope I'd been clinging to. The day of the wedding dawned bright and cruelly beautiful. I woke at 5 a.m., my body knowing the importance of the day, even if my heart refused to acknowledge it. The house was silent, the kind of silence that feels like a guest who won't leave. I made coffee, let it go cold, and stood in the kitchen, still in my nightgown. I thought about putting on the blue dress, not to go to the church, but to see what Margaret had chosen to reject. I slipped it on, the fabric cool against my skin, and looked in the mirror. I didn't see a mother of the bride. I saw a woman who'd been told she didn't belong. I spent the morning imagining the ceremony, the organ playing, "Here Comes the Bride," Margaret in her white dress, Daniel waiting at the altar. I wondered if she'd thought of me, even for a moment. By noon, I changed into my old flannel pajamas and shoved the dress into the back of my closet. I sat on the couch, staring out the window at the oak tree George had planted when Margaret was born. There was no dramatic moment, no sudden clarity, just a slow, aching realization that the daughter I'd raised no longer saw me as part of her story. That night, I lit a candle, not for Margaret, but for myself. I'd spent decades being her mother, her protector, her cheerleader. But who was I without that role? I thought about the woman I'd been before motherhood, Eleanor, who loved tending her rose garden, who sang alto in the church choir, who dreamed of writing a memoir about growing up during the Vietnam War, when my brother was drafted and my mother prayed the rosary every night. I made a quiet promise to that woman. If Margaret didn't want me in her story, I'd start writing my own. The morning after the wedding, Daniel's knock pulled me out of my fog. He stood on my porch, his eyes red-rimmed, his hands stuffed in his pockets. I invited him in, and we sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd taught Margaret to read, where we'd colored Easter eggs, where we'd cried together when George died. Daniel didn't waste time with small talk. "I read your letter," he said, his voice cracking. "The one in the quilt box." I froze. I'd written that letter months ago, pouring my heart into it, tucking it into the gift I'd made for Margaret. I'd assumed she'd thrown it away, unopened, like everything else. "How?" I asked. "It was in the car," he said, "under a pile of her things. She didn't even bring it inside. I opened it because something felt wrong, and when I read it, I saw you. Not the version she described, the overbearing mother, the one who didn't get it. I saw a woman who loved her daughter so fiercely it scared her." He told me Margaret had changed since the wedding, distant, cold, like she'd won a prize but lost something in the process. He'd asked her about me, but she shut down, refusing to talk. "I came here because I needed to understand," he said. "To see you for myself. To tell you that someone should have seen you sooner." I didn't cry. I thanked him, my voice steady. "This isn't your burden to carry, Daniel," I said, "but I'm grateful you came." He nodded, his eyes lingering on a photo of Margaret on the fridge. Her at 8, gap-toothed and grinning in her Sunday dress. "She loved you so much," he said. "I think that's what she's running from." Before he left, he looked at me and said, "If I'd known, I'd have saved you a seat." I smiled, not with bitterness, but with grace. I didn't need a seat, Daniel. I needed to be seen. The weeks that followed were a quiet rebellion. I didn't call Margaret. I didn't beg or plead. I started small, reclaiming pieces of myself I'd forgotten. I joined the knitting circle at St. Paul's, something I'd avoided because it felt too old. But sitting with those women, some widows like me, some with children who'd moved across the country, I found comfort in their stories, their laughter, their shared resilience. I started gardening again, planting dahlias in the backyard and tending to the roses George had loved. I pulled out my old typewriter, the one I'd used in the 70s to write letters to my brother in Vietnam, and began jotting down memories, not just of Margaret, but of my own life. I volunteered at the community center, teaching a memoir writing class for seniors. At first, I was nervous, but the group, men and women in their 70s and 80s, with stories of war, love, and loss, gave me purpose. One man, Harold, wrote about losing his son to addiction and finding solace in painting. A woman named Ruth shared poems about her years as a nurse during the Korean War. Their courage inspired me to share my own story, not about Margaret, but about Eleanor, the girl who'd once dreamed of traveling the world, the woman who'd raised a daughter alone, the survivor who was still standing. I stopped checking Margaret's Facebook, stopped waiting for her to call. I filled my days with meaning: church potlucks, walks with my neighbor Clara, who'd lost her husband to cancer, evenings at the library where I'd read novels like To Kill a Mockingbird or The Help, books I'd missed over the years. I wore the pearl brooch, not for Margaret, but for myself, a reminder of the strength I'd inherited from my mother. My house, once a shrine to my daughter, became mine again. I hung new curtains, bought a record player, and played Ella Fitzgerald, singing along like I used to in my 20s. 2 months after the wedding, a letter arrived in Margaret's familiar handwriting. I held it for an hour before opening it, afraid of what it might say, or what it might not. When I finally read it, the words were simple, but heavy. Dear Mom, I don't know how to fix this. I hurt you, and I did it because I was scared. Not of you, but of failing you. You've always been so strong, so steady, and I thought pushing you away would let me prove I could be my own person. But I was wrong. I read your letter, the one in the quilt. I cried for hours, not just for what I did, but for who I've become. I'm not asking for forgiveness. Not yet. I just want you to know I see you now. I'm sorry. Love, Margaret. I read it again and again, letting the words settle. It wasn't a grand apology, but it was honest. That same week, the phone rang. I saw an unfamiliar number, but answered anyway. Hi, Mom, Margaret said, her voice small, like the girl who'd once called me from summer camp. Homesick. We didn't dive into the pain. We talked about small things. Her bookstore plans, my dahlias, the rainy Virginia weather. She told me Daniel had moved out temporarily, needing space to think. I didn't push. I just listened. A week later, we met at Betty's Diner, the one with the red vinyl booths and the jukebox that still played Johnny Cash. She hugged me, a real hug, not tight, but true. We ordered coffee and apple pie, and she pulled out a photo of us from 1995, both in overalls, picking strawberries at a farm. I found this, she said. I remember how happy I was. I smiled. You ate more berries than you picked. She laughed, her eyes glassy. I'm still learning, Mom. I want to remember us. I nodded. I never stopped hoping you would. We didn't fix everything over pie. Some wounds take time, and trust is rebuilt in moments, not miracles. But we started walking together, literally and figuratively. Once a week, we'd meet at the park, watching kids play and talking about nothing and everything. She came to one of my memoir classes, sitting quietly in the back, listening as I read a piece about my mother's courage during the Great Depression. Afterward, she hugged me and whispered, I'm proud of you. One Sunday, she showed up at my house with a box of old photos and a scrapbook. Let's make something together, she said. We spent hours sorting memories, her first piano recital, our trip to the Grand Canyon, the Christmas we made snow angels in the backyard. We didn't talk about the wedding. We didn't need to. The act of remembering was enough. I looked in the mirror that night, the same mirror I'd faced the day I decided to rebuild. I saw Eleanor, not just Margaret's mother, but a woman who'd survived loss, who'd loved deeply and learned to love herself just as fiercely. The pearl brooch gleamed at my collar, a symbol not of rejection, but of resilience. My house was no longer a waiting room. It was home. Mine. As I sat on the porch, sipping tea under a sky full of stars, I thought of something I'd told Margaret years ago, when a storm washed away her sandcastle on a Virginia beach. Even if it's gone, you'll always know how to build another. I'd rebuilt, not the same life, but a stronger one. And in that quiet evening, I knew I hadn't just found my daughter again. I'd found myself. This journey taught me that our stories, with all their pain and beauty, are worth sharing. They remind us that we're not alone, that our hearts can mend, and that every voice carries weight. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe and share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.